Good morning, everyone. Today, my 2021 summer adventure continues with another bucket list stop. So come with me as I visit the Little Bighorn National Monument. I spent the night in Billings, Montana, and got up early this morning to make the 60-mile drive down Interstate 90 to the Little Bighorn National Monument. This has always been a bucket list destination of mine, so I really don't have a schedule for today. I'm just going to play it by ear. And if my visit takes all day, then so be it. Although I arrived just a few minutes after the park opened at 8 a.m., the parking lots were pretty full, and I had to circle a couple of times to find a space at the visitor center. But I eventually did, and from there, I began my walk up Last Stand Hill. The Battle of the Little Bighorn encompassed 2 days, but I'm going to begin at the end. It was here on what's today is known as Last Stand Hill that George Armstrong Custer and members of the 7th Cavalry made their last stand. By most accounts, it took the Indians less than an hour to defeat the soldiers who sought to defend this high ground. As you make your way up Last Stand Hill, you'll see a group of white military markers in a fenced-off area just below the crest of the hill. These markers show where the dead were found in the days following the battle. George Custer was not the only Custer who died in battle here on Last Stand Hill. His younger brother Boston also died here, just a few steps away from his older brothers Tom and George. Throughout the battlefield, Rangers and Native American volunteers conduct programs at set times during the day. I caught the tail end of this Ranger-led program that was taking place in the shadow of the 7th Cavalry Monument, and I must say, these programs are outstanding and are a great way to better understand what actually took place here. The marker with the black face that we see in the distance marks the location of where George Armstrong Custer fell here on Last Stand Hill. His body was eventually recovered, and today he and his wife Libby are buried in the Post Cemetery at the United States Military Academy at West Point. On June 28, 1876, 3 days after the battle here on Last Stand Hill, survivors of the 7th Cavalry, under the command of Major Marcus Reno, arrived here and began the task of burying the dead. All of the dead, including George Custer and his 2 brothers, Boston and Tom, were buried where they fell, here in shallow graves on Last Stand Hill. Years later, many of the officers, including the Custer brothers, were removed from their graves here on Last Stand Hill and reinterred in cemeteries back east. But most of the enlisted men remained here, and in 1881, those soldiers and any personal possessions were reinterred here beneath this large granite monument. The marker directly in front of Colonel Custer marks the spot where his brother Tom fell and was initially buried. Boston Custer fell further down the hill and to the right. Boston was reinterred in Woodlawn Cemetery in Monroe, Michigan, while Tom is resting in the Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery in Kansas. This storyboard is directly behind the 7th Cavalry Monument, and it details the Indian positions to the east during the closing stages of the battle here on Last Stand Hill. The hills that we see in the distance were occupied by the Indians during the fight on Last Stand Hill. As the soldiers on the hill slowly ran out of ammunition, the Indians rushed in, killing all and claiming victory. Again, the white markers that we see in the distance marks the spot where a soldier fell during the battle. In this area just behind the 7th Cavalry Monument, where some 200 soldiers are buried in a mass grave, is the Horse Cemetery, where the horses killed during the battle were buried in 1881. Until recently, there were no monuments or memorials at the Little Bighorn battlefield dedicated to the Native Americans who fought to defend their home and way of life. Just a short walk down this path in the shadow of Last Stand Hill is a very impressive memorial dedicated to the heroic sacrifice of the Native Americans who fought and died here. Just as the white stones indicate where a soldier fell, these red granite stones mark the place where a Native American fell during the battle. These stones are relatively new to the battlefield. I think the first ones were placed here somewhere around 1996. here we are at the Native American Memorial here at the Little Bighorn Battlefield. The memorial was designed by John Collins and Allison Towers. Their design features a low circular wall that is topped by sculpture by Colleen Cutshaw called Spirit Warriors. As you make your way around the memorial, you will see these panels that detail the Native American beliefs and way of life. If you take time to read them, I'm sure you'll come away a little smarter and with a greater understanding of not only what took place here, but why. I know I did. It took almost 127 years for this memorial to be built. Somewhere around 2001, Congress approved funding for the memorial, which cost $2.3 million, and it was dedicated on June 26, 2003. During the dedication ceremony, Native American tribal and spiritual leaders spoke, along with several government leaders, including United States Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell. There's a lot more to the Little Bighorn Battlefield than the Native American Monument and Last Stand Hill. In fact, the majority of the fighting occurred along a 5-mile road that runs from Last Stand Hill out to the Reno-Benteen part of the battlefield. Along the way, there are several pullouts and storyboards that detail the events that took place at each stop. Total round trip is about 10 miles, and since I'm a reader and I like to stop, it took me a little over 2 hours to make the out and back trip. One of the first stops was here at this pullout that overlooks the main Indian encampment. On June 25, 1876, approximately 7,000 Native Americans were camped here along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. This included between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors. Their numbers far outnumbered the soldiers under the command of George Custer. We're looking south where Custer and his men crossed the mountains in the distance and made their way into the Little Bighorn Valley, where the Indians waited in their camp and in the deep ravines that we see here.
Yeah, in the flats, right on the south end of where the
The mountains that we see in the distance are some 13 miles away, and from a point called the Crow's Nest, Custer scouts got their first look at the Indian pony herd. a sure sign that they were getting close to their objective. The woods that we see along the banks of the Little Bighorn was where Major Reno and his men took up a defensive position. But after about 30 minutes of fighting, the Indians forced Reno and his men to retreat back across the river. And this, as some people would say, was the beginning of the end. Medicine Tail Coulee, for some reason, Custer decided to again split his command as they advanced toward the mouth of the river. He also sent a message to Captain Frederick Benteen to join him without delay, as he believed most of the Indians were still engaged with Major Reno. Custer did not realize that Reno was in retreat and that some of the warriors knew of his advance, and they were on their way to wage an attack on his now divided command. A couple of times during my drive through the battlefield, I had to stop and wait for a herd of wild ponies to cross the road. One of the rangers I spoke with told me that today around 120 wild horses live on the battlefield. He cautioned that we should not try to approach or feed them, as they are wild and will not hesitate to kick or bite you. This is Deep Coulee, and off to my right is the Little Bighorn. I'm not sure what the bleachers are for. I guess they could be used to view a reenactment, but I'm not sure about that either. Here at Greasy Grass Ridge, warriors charged Custer from a deep ravine, forcing the soldiers to retreat toward Last Stand Hill. This was truly the beginning of the end for Custer and the men of the 7th Cavalry. The view of Last Stand Hill from Greasy Grass Ridge. And as Custer and his men made his way up the hill, they were killed on Last Stand Hill. Those white markers in the distance mark where the last of General Custer and his men fell in battle here on Last Stand Hill. I am back on Last Stand Hill, where I started a few hours ago, and back where it all ended for George Custer and the men of the 7th Cavalry almost 150 years ago. And this is where I'm going to end this really long video. As always, hope you'll consider giving me a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please think about subscribing. So now, as I continue my adventure, I'm going to head on down the road and see what's around the bend. So long, everyone.